Good evening. Oh, gee, that worked. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the presidential address for 2020. My name is Mary Lindemann. I am the incoming president of the AHA, but not quite yet. And it is my responsibility, but also pleasure, to introduce John McNeill for his presidential address this evening. And they've not given me a light, so I don't know how this is going to work. Okay. While preparing this introduction, I rather strangely stumbled across a novel on climate called The Ice Lovers by one J. McNeill. After a bit of Googling, I was rather relieved, I think, to learn that this J. McNeill was not John R. McNeill, the president of the AHA, and that John had not yet written a novel, but he's still got time. Nor is he John McNeill, the jazz trumpeter. But I would not have been overly surprised to discover that John had done all those things on his way to his place on the podium this evening. And despite these somewhat inexplicable gaps in his curriculum vitae, there still remains a good deal to say about this John McNeill, even if he never realized some youthful ambitions to play center field for the White Sox or resolve for Ma's,
There's still time.
Not for that one, but you may still resolve for Fermat's last theorem. He also had ambitions as a mathematician at one time. It is trite to say, but nonetheless true, that it is difficult, indeed impossible, to squeeze an incredibly full lifetime into the span of a short introduction, especially to do justice to a career so richly variegated as John's. For more detail, I suggest you turn to George Virtus's excellent biographical sketch, which I think many of you have. For me, however, the most salient feature of John's scholarship lies in his unrivaled ability to see the new, not merely run after novelty for its own sake or as a good career move. Rather, John's resume highlights a series of innovative and original works that far exceed what we normally consider excellent scholarship. A serial review of his many publications would be odious and, for that matter, unnecessary, but also would, I feel, fail to really catch the shape of a truly extraordinary career. John's contributions have touched, actually transformed, many areas of historical research. What has most impressed me, however, is not the quite overwhelming number of his publications, the books, the articles, the occasional pieces in the Washington Post, or even the many awards they have garnered. Rather, it is the way in which John's career reflects the plurality of interests and activities simultaneously characterizing his scholarship, his teaching, and his role as a public intellectual. John's dissertation, which came out finished about the same year mine was, John's dissertation showed some of these interests. In some ways, I imagine, one might view his first book on Louisburg and Havana as an urban history and a history of 18th century empires. In it, John placed himself in the vanguard of Atlantic history before it became a burgeoning field it is today. Remember, it was written in the early 1980s, when colonial history, as it was then called, was not the surest path to historical renown. Perhaps his dive into global history proved a logical next step, yet typically it was bound up with a broader venture into the field of environmentalism, where his contributions have encouraged and nurtured a bold and expansive consideration of world system history. A tsunami of works flooded out of his computer after the turn of the millennium and included collaborative, encyclopedic, and reference works, such as his 3-volume co-edited Encyclopedia of World Environment History and his co-authored The Human Web, a bird's-eye view of human history, as well as studies that analyze the environmental histories of specific times and places over centuries and continents. But if John's purview was frequently, impressively global, he never neglected the many regions that first sparked his curiosity. Perhaps the initial acquaintance of many in this audience with John's opus comes from reading his prize-winning Mosquito Empires, Ecology and War in the Greater Caribbean, a topic that speaks to me very strongly as I live in Miami. This project took him back to the Caribbean, but also opened another file in his scholarly portfolio, the environmental impact of war, whether hot shooting wars like World War I or the equally decisive Cold War. All this led me to think about the various false dichotomies that so often govern our scholarly world, and that John's career so brilliantly refutes. I refer to the ones purportedly dividing research from teaching, ivory tower intellectuals from real-world movers and shakers, and last but not least, perhaps the most pernicious of all, that what C.P. Snow once, a long time ago, defined as two cultures, a split that has recently revived in the tension between STEM and the humanities. John has never been just on one side or another of these supposed incommensurables. His entire life story demonstrates that the scholar-teacher is not a unicorn, but quite marvelous, by no means mythical being. Likewise, although he has written scholarly works by the score, many specifically directed to an academic audience, he has also been active in the public sphere. Yet perhaps his influence is weightiest in the most pressing issue of our time, climate and environmental change. The range of his contributions on world environmental history, combined with many finer-grained studies, such as Mosquito Empires and the mountains of the Mediterranean, have not only inspired historians, they have had a crucial impact on climate activists. In works like Something New Under the Sun, John not only blended world system analysis and climate science, he contributed to the development and popularization of the Great Acceleration narrative, helped shape the definition of the Anthropocene, and fostered an awareness of anthropogenic changes, which was the subject of last night's plenary session. A recent work on the Anthropocene credits Will Steffen and the International Geosphere Biosphere programs with establishing, this is a quote, the mainstream scientific narrative of human-induced global environmental change. But, the author continued, the same striking speed-up that surprised Earth system scientists were actually already common knowledge among environmental historians, especially John McNeill, end of quote. The work of John McNeill underscores the fact that the most tangled and pressing problems plaguing contemporary society will surely not be solved by ever more technology or ever more science alone, but by the respectful interaction of scientists and humanists alike, which he personifies. These will reshape history as well as science, as John will now demonstrate in his presidential address on Peak Document and the Future of Historical Research. Join me in welcoming John McNeill.
Thank you very much.
Now let's see if I can get down these steps. No, I don't sit here. I don't know.
So Mary seems already to have started my presentation here. Perhaps she's hoping it will be briefer than it will. Thank you, Mary, for those kind words. Only my mother would believe all of that. And thank you all for turning out, staying in when you could be enjoying the attractions of Midtown Manhattan. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. A few years ago, I had the good fortune to join a troop of geologists tramping around eastern Iceland on the trail of a jökulhlaup. Oops. A jökulhlaup is a glacial outburst flood. If you can read this, perhaps if you can't, I should explain. Sometimes when volcanoes erupt underneath glaciers, they break, they melt in short order, an ice dam that restrains billions of gallons of water, all of which drain in a hurry, creating a gigantic flood in Iceland called a jökulhlaups. These exist in Alaska, Antarctica, and a few other places. Jökulhlaup research follows a complex scientific formula. 50 rock chisels, 1 rock hammer, 4 fearless students, and erratics. Erratics are boulders that are found where they shouldn't be. And if they are rounded in shape, that means they've been put there by a flood, tumbling through a flood. If all goes well, if no fingers are bludgeoned, the formula yields rock samples. Our rock samples implied a 9,200-year-old jökulhlaup, a disappointment to me because I was hunting for a jökulhlaup that came after human settlement of Iceland, which is only about 1,200 years old. But as failures go, this was fun and interesting, trying to read history from the rocks rather than from documents. Before leaving Iceland in defeat, I visited the National Museum in Reykjavik, where I stumbled upon an exhibit concerning the early settlement history of Iceland. As recently as 2004, Icelandic scholars working mainly from archaeological data reckoned that the Icelandic population was 60 to 90% Norwegian in origin, and the Icelandic sagas, written down some centuries after the events they describe, give an even stronger sense of Norwegian origins of modern Icelanders. But the museum exhibit told a different story. Using data collected from roughly half of the 325,000 people in Iceland, geneticists had concluded that about 2/3 of the mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to daughter, of today's Icelanders bore a powerful resemblance to that in current Irish and Scottish populations. Only 1/6 of the DNA passed from father to son seemed to be from Scottish and Irish groups. So the founding fathers, it turns out, were indeed mainly from Norway, as supposed, but not the founding mothers. The geneticists, it seemed, had succeeded in reconstructing the past without documents. I was temporarily enraptured by the promise of what I later learned to call paleogenomics. States of rapture rarely last. Pitfalls in paleogenomics abound. Not long after my visit to Iceland, I attended a talk in Munich by a geneticist who worked with human remains from late antiquity. Among the things she said in reference to genetic profiles, one in particular struck me then and stayed with me ever since. I can tell a German when I see one. This was uttered in a building roughly 15 minutes on foot from the old Nazi Party headquarters on Briennerstrasse. The geneticist, I am sure, was no Nazi and merely meant that it is possible to identify which ancient human remains have the strongest genetic resemblance to modern German populations. But she seemed to equate Germani of 1,600 years ago with modern Germans and sounded as if she sympathized with infamous attempts to essentialize and biologize ethnic and religious identities. What she seemed not to know about the resonances of her words astonished me. But then, if I had been speaking about genetics, what I would have seemed, with good reason, not to know would have astonished her. I tell you these two stories because I'm about to do what only my most reckless predecessors among AHA presidents have done: speculate about the future of history. We're often told that technology will revolutionize the future. And I wonder whether it will revolutionize the past. I will raise the question, without properly answering it, of whether or not we will reach a point that might be called peak document, when the utility of research in texts and documents will begin to decline relative to research that uses other sorts of sources. I phrase this as I do in loose homage to the statistical studies of the U.S. oil industry by M. King Hubbard, who in 1956 coined the term peak oil. My question then is whether the rate of interesting and useful new historical discoveries derived from written documents might peak and slowly decline. As with oil, this is not to be confused with the sheer volume of extant documents. That volume is, for the time being at least, surely set to grow. So while I am not certain that peak document will necessarily arrive, the possibility that it might tempts me to explore some possible implications for historical research, given the flood, as I will often refer to it, of new information about the human past that has lately come and will come in greater measure in the years ahead, perhaps a Jökulaups, from tools and techniques of the natural sciences, rather than from reading what was written on old pieces of paper, parchment, or papyrus. Most AHA presidential addresses over the last 134 years conform to one of two models. The first is the research talk. It has the great merit that the speakers usually know a lot about their subject. The second model was the reflection upon the profession of history. And that reflection model had two subforms. The retrospective, what has happened to the profession since I joined it, and the sermon, here's what historians should do. In the early years of the AHA, the reflection on our profession was much the preferred approach. James Ford Rhodes, in 1899, to give but one example, lamented that no modern historians match the insight of Thucydides, and the entire output of historians since Herodotus is less valuable than the works of Shakespeare. And this is from a scholar whose office obliged him to promote the interests of historians. The early addresses, incidentally, were often only about 1/3 as long as the average since the 1950s. The champion was Henry Adams. In 1894, he assessed the tendency of history, since his youth, at 2,600 words. And this from a scholar who had written a 9-volume history of the United States when its history was only half as long as it is now. Adams mailed it in, literally. He was at sea, somewhere between Mexico and Tahiti, at the time of the AHA's annual meeting. I will match neither his brevity nor his nonchalance. The reflection on history fell out of fashion in the 1930s, accepting a brief revival between 1957 and 1963. In 1957, the president argued that the next assignment for historians should be to take up psychoanalytic frameworks. The president in 1962 felt that history had genuflected too deeply in the direction of the psychological and social sciences and risked losing its audience. Almost no presidents since 1962 have reverted to the tradition of the AHA's early years, although in 1989, Lewis Harlan offered a variation on the venerable tradition, reflecting on the future of the American Historical Association in an address nearly as brief as Adams'. Perhaps Harlan feared the AHA had a short future ahead of it. He advocated higher dues. I intend to depart from the modern trend, but at the same time be more cautious than my courageous sermonizing predecessors. I'll try to keep prescription to a minimum, but I am going to reflect on what is happening in historical research, or perhaps I should say to historical research and the historical profession. Evolving social and political concerns have changed and always will change what historians regard as worth their while. But I'll be speaking about a different change, one that I judge potentially revolutionary, and like many revolutions, fraught with peril as well as filled with promise. Paleogeneticists, paleoclimatologists, paleopathologists, paleo-everything are flooding the scientific landscape with new information about the human past, and so are archaeologists armed with new tools. This development, I should note, is not so alien to certain groups of historians who have long worked with few or no written sources. Africanists focused on periods before 1800 work with oral traditions, archaeology, historical linguistics, and other tools of their trade rarely needed by those of us who work in document-rich environments. One Africanist referred to preparation in pre-colonial African history as the decathlon of historical training. To some extent, what I think might be coming represents an Africanistization of our discipline of history. I'll offer a few examples before speculating on the implications of it all. First, genes and proteins. Most of us are aware that DNA analysis of living persons helps shift the prevailing view as to whether or not Sally Hemings' 6 children were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Genome sequencing has gotten a lot cheaper and better since that work, with technical advances known as next-generational sequencing. No longer must geneticists have a case with the star power of the Jefferson-Hemings controversy to justify the expense of doing work that won't help cure diseases. One arena in which paleogenomics has earned its salt is disease history. The debate over whether or not the Black Death was bubonic plague is now more or less resolved, thanks to multiple ancient DNA diagnoses of Black Death victims, notably in London's East Smithfield Cemetery. Genome-scale study of plague in recent years has revealed much that written sources could not. For example, that the pathogens behind the Black Death and the Justinianic plague of the 540s were extremely similar, and that both originated in Central Asian plague reservoirs. Fast forwarding, hastily, and leaving disease history behind for the moment, DNA analysis performed on saliva absorbed into the clay of an early 19th century tobacco pipe indicates that one smoker on the Belvoir plantation just outside Annapolis was a woman probably of or descended from the Mende people in what is now Sierra Leone. No document could tell us that. Fast forwarding again, Spain has about 120,000 decaying bodies in mass graves dating from the 1936-39 Spanish Civil War. Arguments rage about who massacred whom. In 2011, a Spanish government saw fit to close the archives that contain records relevant to murders committed by Franco's supporters during the Civil War. However, since that closure, teams have recently undertaken DNA work on skeletal remains to ascertain the family identities of the murdered. Fast forwarding one last time and returning to the arena of disease history. In 1987, a best-selling book that was made into a movie identified an Air Canada flight attendant as responsible for bringing HIV to the United States and launching the AIDS epidemic here. Decades later, that interpretation has been decisively refuted by genomic sleuthing. HIV was in the US well before patient zero helped to spread it. A field that parallels paleogenomics is proteomics, or the study of proteins. Proteins can now be chemically analyzed quickly and cheaply compared to 5 years ago. It is apparently possible to ascertain that the registry pages that record deaths in Milan during the plague year of 1630 are peppered with proteins derived not only from Yersinia pestis, the plague pathogen, but also from chickpeas, rice, carrots, maize, and tobacco, a window into the consumption habits of the city's clerks. Proteomics also tells us that postcards received and handled by the playwright Anton Chekhov betray residues of the tuberculosis bacterium. Chekhov died of TB at age 44. Studies of proteins inadvertently inscribed onto paper can tell us things that the deliberately inscribed texts do not. Conservators at the Folger Library in Washington are now wondering whether they should also try to preserve the dust on their old manuscripts. This is a mere scattering of examples that have come to my notice recently. They illuminate ancient, modern, and contemporary history. And there are thousands of other historical subjects, great and small, on which natural scientists are having their say. Indeed, an AHA plenary in Chicago a year ago touched on some of these subjects, and a few more such subjects are on the program here in New York. Archaeologists for decades have, with greater or lesser enthusiasm, embraced the use of natural sciences in their work. Lately, they've acquired a new tool, light ranging and detection, or LIDAR. LIDAR is a form of remote sensing undertaken from airplanes, helicopters, drones, buzzing overhead. A laser beam's reflection measures the distance to surface features on the ground and is then translated into a digital 3D image of the ground surface. LIDAR can detect tiny differences, a few millimeters, in ground elevation, and can do so through every tiny hole in forest canopies. In forested settings, it finds things that archaeologists miss when walking the ground: low mounds, foundations, roads, and other structures not visible through thick mats of vegetation. And LIDAR is cheap compared to the price of employing armies of survey archaeologists, and getting cheaper all the time. Since 2010, LIDAR has been revolutionizing understandings of the past in Central America, Amazonia, Southeast Asia, and other lands now partly covered with forest canopy. In Central America, its impact has been likened to the Hubble telescope's effect on astronomy. LIDAR reveals much more extensive settlement, building, and cultivation in the Maya lowlands than archaeologists had imagined. Lowland Maya population estimates of the classic period, that's 200 to 900 CE, are much higher than they were just a few years ago. And some specialists say even 10 to 15 million people in the Maya lowlands. Last year, LIDAR revealed 60,000 stone features, new to archaeology, mainly platforms on which typical Maya thatch huts stood in Guatemala's swampy Petén region. The Bird of Paradise settlement in Belize was revealed 3 months ago to be 5 times larger than scholars had previously recognized. And there's much more to come, because only 10 to 15% of the Maya lowlands have been surveyed by LIDAR. In Cambodia, LIDAR has yielded results nearly as revolutionary. Entirely new cities, so to speak, have emerged from the forest in the Angkor culture area. Here's one. You can see the green are features that archaeologists had found using traditional methods. The darker color, features discernible only thanks to LIDAR, and the grid pattern was invisible before, and the extent and scope of features was invisible before, or not fully visible. In southern Amazonia, LIDAR research now suggests pre-Columbian population density 2.5 times as great as the highest prior estimates for a region the size of California. Villages were not clustered only along the bigger rivers in Amazonia, as supposed. And LIDAR shows that people throughout all of southern Amazonia were digging similarly ditched enclosures, implying a degree of cultural interaction throughout a considerable region amongst peoples often imagined to be isolated. The potential of LIDAR for revising history in now forested regions is tantalizing. And as the technology gets cheaper, the rate of interesting discovery will likely quicken. New scientific instruments permit the study of formerly invisible evidence not only beneath canopies, but right under our noses as well, in the tiny layers of our teeth. Electron microscopes, first developed in the 1930s, have improved lately. They can magnify things up to 50 million times. And with this power, you can see individual layers put on every day on growing teeth. Like annual tree rings, these layers provide a datable record of conditions for growth. From the second trimester in the womb, fetuses begin to make teeth, and most people's teeth continue to grow until about age 20. The thin layers on teeth register stress and nutrition on a daily basis, like a diary. Study of the dental layers makes fetal and childhood health history accessible in the absence of texts. Baby teeth betray the nutritional stress of weaning, allowing inferences about the average age at weaning in past societies. And according to Tanya Smith in her book, Tales Teeth Tell, which I recommend to everybody, it is possible to infer how many times a woman has given birth before the age at which her teeth stop taking notes. Tooth enamel is the hardest part of our bodies. It endures very well. It provides entree into the deeper past. But teeth layers also contain evidence of the recent past. Those of us born after 1945 but before the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty carry around in our mouths a daily chronology of radiation from nuclear testing. Looks like a fair proportion of the audience is providing that service to future historians. Constraints such as your patience and the ghost of Henry Adams prevent me from exploring other arenas in which new tools and techniques open new possibilities for the study of history. But I should mention, at least in passing, the advent of supercomputers. Supercomputers confer new power upon historical linguistics, making inquiries feasible that were once too laborious to contemplate, and so too with climate history. Perhaps the ultimate application of supercomputing will be in the form of artificial intelligence. So far as I can tell, that hasn't had much impact on historical research beyond powering Google Scholar. But one day, probably not too far into the future, the U.S. National Archives will likely be using artificial intelligence to decide which government documents are worthy of preservation and which ought to be destroyed. Some of us don't look forward to that day, but it is probably on its way. Koreans are using artificial intelligence to help with a different document problem. Most records of their history were written in Chinese until the 20th century. The Institute for the Translation of Korean Classics is embarked on human translations of a subset of these records and expects it will take more than 150 years of work on the part of teams of bilingual experts. So, at the same time, the Institute is teaming up with Korea's Astronomy and Space Science Institute to train computers to recognize patterns in strings of Chinese characters, review all the extant Korean translations of those strings, and then select the most probable ones. If this works, it'll make the records of Korean history accessible to ordinary Koreans in decades rather than centuries. It's hard to imagine that artificial intelligence will not profoundly affect procedures of research in history. After all, it excels at pattern recognition, which is what historians do. And while I am keen to see what LIDAR or paleogenomics will come up with next, I must confess I do not look forward to the day when artificial intelligence can perform historical research as well or better than you or I. The mounting flood, if it is indeed that, has some implications for our academic tribe. Beginning with the obvious, it will probably have a modest demonicizing influence upon history. As we historians like to point out, texts are likelier to offer the voice of the powerful rather than the powerless. This, I think, is likely to be less true of LIDAR, paleogenomics, teeth layer studies, and historical linguistics. LIDAR shows the humble pavements in the forest where previously only pyramids and palaces had protruded from the canopy. Paleogenomics and historical linguistics address the behavior of communities rather than individuals. What might the flood imply for various periods of history? First, it should lengthen our sense of history and sweep forever into the dustbin of history the concept of prehistory. Texts go back about 5,000 years. Practitioners of historical linguistics think their evidence reaches back about 8,000 years or more. Ancient DNA, at present, can extend our vision back about 70,000 years, and inferences based on genomes of people alive today are useful for the entire history of our species, and indeed those ancestral to us. Will we, in the fullness of time, find that the most exciting things to study are longer ago? My guess is that the answer will more often become yes, despite the fact that for many of us, the world of our parents and our grandparents will always be more compelling than that of unknown people millennia ago. The last century or two presumably will be least affected by the flood of findings from non-textual sources, which is not to say unaffected. So I think. But who knows, really, what proteomics might reveal about the Civil War? What might the mounting flood mean for geographic fields rather than periods of history? Will LIDAR help shift historians' attention to the understudied forested tropics if bigger populations turn out to have been living there in more complex societies in places like the Maya lowlands? Will we continue to cede the study of most such places to anthropology and archaeology if it turns out that these places and times were more important to the human past than we imagined? Once upon a time, our discipline behaved as if Africa had no history and left its study to others. But our forebears learned better. Will paleogenomics, putting LIDAR aside, have a geography to it as well? Probably yes. The availability of the raw material for paleogenomics varies from place to place for reasons both of physical geography and culture. Ancient DNA survives poorly where heat, humidity, and soil acidity are high, and burial customs affect the likelihood of human DNA preservation. And societies in which cremation prevailed over burial left little for DNA hunters to find. The patchiness of paleogenomic geography will likely proceed not merely from preservation potential. Some peoples, understandably, prefer that their ancestors be left in respectful peace rather than subject to genetic examinations. Paleogenomics based on analysis of living people will likely also shed only a dappled light on history. Some individuals wish to see their genetic material studied, and others, like me, recoil at the prospect. But there could be larger patterns than personal preference, patterns shaped by culture and economics. Can one imagine half of all Americans agreeing, as Icelanders have done, to have their genetic profiles examined in the alleged interest of public health? No. Where suspicion of authority, expertise, and science runs high, cooperation in such matters will run low. And one can imagine great differences in populations around the world in their willingness to take part in the collection of DNA, and great differences in the price point at which they would overcome their mistrust and agree to sell a drop of blood or a swab of saliva. And is it too Orwellian to imagine circumstances in which entire national populations or distrusted minorities are compelled to undergo genetic testing in the name of national health? If you look at this, you'll see in recent years the wildly uneven geographic distribution of ancient DNA studies. That A, DNA, should be run together. Small a, capital DNA. Code word for ancient DNA. And lately, it's almost all in Europe and North America. 2016 was an exception. How might the mounting flood affect thematic fields of history? It has already altered some, including environmental history and disease history. I imagine the candidates for greatest disruption also include the history of nutrition, agriculture, pastoralism, urbanism, migration, and climate. I suppose that intellectual history is among the least likely to undergo turmoil resulting from LIDAR or paleogenomics. But it's hard to know how new tools will evolve and how historians will make use of them. And the application of artificial intelligence could be a boon to intellectual history. Or it could make it easier but not better. In short, I expect to see the fortunes of historical fields, whether defined chronologically, geographically, or thematically, rearranged by the coming flood, just like erratics on the landscape of Iceland. All right, enough musings about intellectual directions. What might the meaning of all this be for the institutions and structures of history as a profession in this country? First, could it change the least iconoclastic corner of our profession, the academic job market? Today, academic history jobs are defined much as they were 50 years ago. Historian of modern China, colonial Latin America, antebellum US. There are now a few jobs with titles and descriptions unknown in 1970, gender historian, transnational historian, but they remain a tiny minority, and it is their subject matter more than their methods that distinguishes them. This inertia, or consistency, if you prefer, contrasts with what has happened in the discipline of geography in the same 50 years. Back in 1970, academic geographers divvied up the world. There were regional geographers of Africa, Europe, Latin America. But nowadays, geography positions in academia are increasingly not defined this way, but in terms of methodological specialty, remote sensing, GIS, and in terms of thematic specialty, biogeography, geomorphology, ocean-atmosphere interactions. I looked at the faculty website for 5 of the biggest and best geography departments in this country, and I found that about 25% of academic geographers mention any specific place in their website self-description. And the younger they are, the less likely they are to do so. New tools have redefined the profession of geography, including its job market. Will new tools do the same to our profession? Will we, in 20 years, be defining positions for historians adept in ancient DNA analysis, paleoclimatology? I don't know. And I never want to underestimate inertia. But it might already be happening with digital history. If the flood continues to mount, if peak document approaches, will we reconsider how we train future historians? For ages, many historians have had to learn paleography and foreign languages. More recently, professional training came to include at least a smattering of quantitative skills and sometimes an acquaintance with British social anthropology and literary theory and a few other new accoutrements. All that seems strenuous enough. And now, he says, half the paleosciences. The specter of a 15-year PhD program, a decapentathlon of historical training, looms. How much of all this should historians in training seek to acquire, and how much should be expected of them? Of course, not every historian needs every tool. Some of us never use foreign languages or paleography. But it's not easy to know in advance exactly what one will need, unless one somehow knows exactly what one will research over a lifetime. So perhaps the formation of historians ought to be reimagined so as to include training sabbaticals after a career is underway. As one's interests evolve, one's toolkit needs to evolve. And sometimes, even if one's interests don't evolve, one still needs to understand new tools to keep up. Can we adjust our understanding of careers to accommodate that? Preparing some historians, but not others, to understand and use new research techniques deriving from science carries certain risks. We might fall prey to our own version of the two cultures that Mary Lindemann alluded to. If some historians train only with texts, while others are trained to work with geneticists and computational linguists, would enough commonality remain for historians to endure as a disciplinary community? So far, we've weathered 150 years of diversification of interests and modest diversification of methods. If history as a discipline were to splinter into two or more cultures, that would strike me and Jim Grossman as calamitous. But if it happens, at least I won't be AHA president at the time. Do we have in place the right institutions to pursue historical research in this kind of future? Universities, museums, public agencies, and other institutions engaged in historical research have long had units devoted to it, and that has proved enormously fruitful. But if peak document is coming, perhaps the point of diminishing returns for these same structures is also coming. There are a few groups and institutions now trying to integrate text-based history and the paleosciences on a modest scale. I'd like to see more efforts so that we can find out more about what might work and what might not. If I had the bank balance of a Bezos or a Buffett, of which there is little risk, I'd be tempted to try to create multiple research institutes, all dedicated to the study of the human past by all available means. Will we need new types of research institutes, newly configured universities, or something so different from the current landscape that I can't begin to imagine it? If historical research comes to depend in larger proportion on expensive tools, what will that mean? Will it give an additional edge to the richly endowed institutions and heighten the obstacles for all the rest, creating another two cultures divide? I fear it might. Of course, a few years ago, I thought MOOCs would do something similar to the teaching of history, and so far I have been happily wrong. New tools create new hazards. One is to neglect limitations. Paleogenomics can never tell us about what people thought about art or God. None of the new tools that I've mentioned, with the exception of the study of teeth with electron microscopes, is good for generating precise chronologies of the sort dear to most of us. And some of the new tools discourage scholars from acquiring a sense of place. Historians, like geographers and anthropologists, often build up over the years a useful familiarity with a place and its cultures. That is less likely to happen if one gathers one's information from data sets based on ancient DNA, or from climate proxies, or from LIDAR. When reading what two economists have done with recently available genetic data, I'm reminded of the adage that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Although, with due respect to their formidable learning in some arenas, perhaps the adage should be amended to read, a lot of knowledge applied confidently in ignorance of all competing knowledge is a dangerous thing. With admirable mathematical rigor, two economists claim to show that the high genetic diversity of African populations, Ethiopians apparently are number one, and the low genetic diversity of Bolivians accounts for their respective economic histories, including levels of prosperity today. Because of human migration from Africa some 70,000 years ago and subsequent settlement of all the globe, the geographical distance from Ethiopia creates a declining gradient of genetic diversity. That much is not in great dispute. But there's more. That gradient, they maintain, shaped economic performance over millennia. And there is, they maintain, a Goldilocks middle ground of genetic diversity, occupied by Asians and Europeans, that is optimal for economic development. And they calculate that adding 1% more genetic diversity to the Bolivian population would raise GDP per capita by 30 to 40%. And lowering it by a mere 1% in Ethiopia would raise prosperity by about 20%. Now, I am sure that these authors are smart people. Their work appears in one of the world's most prestigious economics journals. But their argument strikes me as ignorant and illogical in the extreme for reasons that I will explain in the February issue of the AHR. Although you could probably guess most of them. No doubt they will find my ideas, should they read them, short on rigor, despite being published next month in the world's most prestigious history journal. Inadequate appreciation of the complexities of other disciplines and other lines of evidence creates a moonscape of potholes and pitfalls. Many scholars, myself included, are too often guilty of skating over the thin ice of unfamiliar disciplines. We tend to seek simplification, understandably. We're guilty of an equivalent of seeing like a state, imposing a simplifying legibility upon the chaotic and messy, for otherwise we can't use the results of our colleagues' exciting work. To the extent we become enthralled with what I've been calling the new flood, we redirect our attention to certain evidence, themes, and subjects for which the new tools are helpful, and away from many others. An example is the recent tendency to take paleoclimatological information and concoct monocausal explanations of the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties. No one did so before the relevant climate data became available. No one should do so now. I said I wouldn't make prescriptions, but that's an exception. Preference for one variety of evidence over all others, although tempting, is a recipe for trouble. Now, as I see it, this temptation is parallel to historians' long-standing text fetish. That text fetish resulted in a wild exaggeration of the significance of bureaucratic, read document generating and document keeping, states in human affairs. Historians marched conscientiously along paper trails with scarcely a glance to either side, and were drawn to suppose that peoples without paper trails were peoples without history. In any case, the new tools will also tempt scholars along certain paths to the neglect of others. At present, given how we're trained and conditioned, the best way to avoid pitfalls may be for historians to work together with others in multidisciplinary teams, a practice at odds with our long tradition and with the confirmed habits of most of us. But surely our social skills, on average, are equal to those of economists and chemists. Indeed, a small but growing handful of historians is already collaborating with geneticists, volcanologists, computer scientists, and a range of other scientific specialists. Of course, such teamwork has its own drawbacks. Multi-authored publications across disciplines are, on average, clunkier for having been written by multidisciplinary teams, and I fancy myself a genuine authority on clunky co-authorship. Journals have rules about formatting articles that vary considerably among the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, and can frustrate authors whose collaborations pull them across the borders. And of course, most natural scientists recoil at the thought of books. More fundamentally, teammates are rarely equal in voice and power. Some can bring big money to the table and some cannot. And that affects the questions that get asked and the approaches taken to their solution. These are yawning pitfalls, too. At one level, the mounting flood is disconcerting for an old dog, me, who cannot expect to learn new tricks properly. At another level, it's disconcerting for what it might mean for our profession in practical terms. It may put heavier demands on those seeking to become historians. It may make things harder for all but the richest institutions. Yet, for all that, the mounting flood is also a thrilling prospect. It promises a giant expansion in our knowledge of the human past. And who among us cannot welcome that? The blending of textual and non-textual sources should eventually give us a fuller and finer history than we've been able to assemble so far. So I urge a full but cautious embrace of all the paleosciences, alert to the pitfalls. This seems far preferable to going about our business as usual and leaving the interpretation of paleoscientific data to others. Historians must not be shy. We bring to the table skills and sensitivities that others lack. We are, by training, alert to the complexities of causality and rarely enchanted by monocausal explanations. We are, by training, alive to context and comparison, almost instinctively assessing the plausibility of arguments and interpretations by making reference to other situations we know about. We are, by training, aware that not everything that counts can be counted. We are good at understanding how and why societies change and how and why people operate in groups. And of course, we know the documents, where there are documents, and can blend, or at least help blend, textual evidence with paleoscientific data to achieve something akin to parallax vision. So we should not hesitate to offer our expertise, to insert ourselves at every opportunity when and where paleoscientists are at work reconstructing the human past. One last word, which is that there can be no last word. At some distant point in the future, new information from the paleosciences will peak too. The rate at which new and interesting paleogenetic or paleoclimatological data appear will fall once most of the low-hanging fruit has been grabbed. and perhaps quickly, like a waning yokel lamp. What happens to the study of history then? I haven't a glimmer, but maybe, just maybe, the relative significance of textual documents will make a comeback. Thank you very much.